Hey everyone, welcome back. Go ahead and dim the lights, shuffle under whatever blanket situation you've got going on, and maybe take a warm sip of whatever counts as your evening comfort drink. Tonight, we're floating back to the 1600s, a century so dramatic that even Christmas needed a time out. And yes, I know, the idea of Christmas disappearing sounds like something out of a bargain bin dystopian novel, but the 17th century actually flirted with exactly that, because of course it did. So just breathe, let your shoulders drop a little, and get ready for a slow drift through political pettiness, religious over-caffeination, and some of the best "I'm not mad, I'm just extremely disappointed" energy ever expressed by a government. Christmas was not always the cozy, gingerbread-scented holiday we know today. In the 1600s, it was more like a magnet for complaints, anxieties, and theological meltdowns. And yes, we'll be gliding through all of it, gently, with the calmest tonal delivery imaginable. Now, let's drift into how Christmas almost vanished, not because of supply chain shortages, not because of a global crisis, but because a group of extremely stern men in tall black hats decided holiday cheer was simply too cheerful. Let's start by easing into the late 1500s and early 1600s, where Europe was already dealing with its usual cocktail of political tension, religious fragmentation, and monarchs who were somehow both exhausted and exhausting. The Reformation had already happened. Everyone was still arguing about what exactly Christianity should look like, and nobody could agree on whether holidays should be fun or if fun itself was a moral hazard. Picture early modern England for a moment. It's winter, it's dark, people are cold and tired, food is limited, and yet every December, folks looked forward to what was basically the medieval and Renaissance version of a week-long food binge with bonus drinking. Christmas meant feasts, games, music, wassailing, rowdy carol slinging, and the occasional "let's dress up and make fun of authority" tradition that kings pretended they didn't mind. It was chaotic, but in a charming way. Like the 1600s equivalent of your one cousin who gets way too into charades. But while the average person thought this was all great, the Puritans, oh yes, the Puritans, were sitting in the corner, quietly sharpening their theological pencils. And the more they looked around at Christmas festivities, the more their eyebrows ascended into the atmosphere. To them, the holiday was suspiciously joyful, suspiciously decorative, suspiciously Catholic. And if the Puritans had a motto, it was basically, if it looks vaguely fun, it is probably a sin. They believed that Christmas wasn't biblically mandated, that early Christians didn't celebrate it, and that the whole winter festival vibe was a leftover from pagan traditions. In fairness, they weren't entirely wrong. But as we'll see, they definitely took that observation and sprinted with it. Meanwhile, England was being ruled by the Stuart monarchs, who were kind of like the old Tudor dynasty's awkward cousins. They had a flair for absolutism, a fondness for ceremony, and a shocking inability to read the room. James I, who started the Stuart line in England, actually enjoyed Christmas. He even wrote about it. And his son, Charles I, enjoyed it even more, because Charles loved anything involving lavish tradition, pretty things, or being in charge. Christmas was right up his alley.
This put Charles I and the Puritans on kind of a slow-motion collision course. One liked pomp, ritual, and the delightful illusion of political harmony. The other preferred sermon marathons and quiet reflection interrupted only by additional sermons. We're going to glide gently, very gently, toward the moment when things got messy. By the 1630s, Puritans didn't just dislike Christmas, they actively described it with the energy of someone reviewing a hotel room that had bedbugs. Christmas, they said, encouraged gluttony. It encouraged drunkenness. It distracted people from real spiritual duties. It encouraged theater performances, which they found morally questionable at best and demonically suspicious at worst. And worst of all, it involved decorations. And if anything the Puritans could not abide, it was a garland. But while they grumbled, Charles I continued to enjoy his holiday festivities. The court celebrated, churches decorated, people drank, ate, and played their games. It was the kind of tension where everyone pretended things were fine, while their internal monologues were having extremely pointed thoughts. This all changed in the 1640s, the period where England looked at political compromise and said, "No, thank you." The English Civil War broke out, and Christmas found itself caught between two sides that disliked each other so much they were basically allergic to compromise. On one side, the Royalists, who supported Charles and enjoyed the lively traditions of the season. On the other, the Parliamentarians, who were dominated by Puritans and were basically ready to put Christmas on trial for crimes of seriousness. Imagine Christmas slowly backing into a corner, whispering, I didn't ask to be involved. Let's float into 1647, the year that the parliamentarian-controlled government finally made its move. Parliament decided that Christmas, along with Easter, Whitsun, and a variety of other celebrations, needed to go. They officially abolished them. Just gone. Off the calendar. You could imagine the announcement having the same vibe as someone saying, "I've decided we're not doing birthdays anymore because they encourage too much cake." To the Puritans, this wasn't meant to be cruel. In their minds, they were restoring Christianity to its pure form. They saw it as removing distractions and encouraging austerity. But to literally everyone else, this was like taking away the one mildly cheerful moment in the bleak midwinter, a sort of national, please let us have one thing moment. And people did not take it quietly. Well, quietly by 17th century standards, which still involved a fair amount of mumbling and passive-aggressive church attendance. Across the country, there were protests. Small ones, local ones, usually more grumpy than violent. People decorated their homes anyway. Bakers sold mince pies under the table like they were running a black market pastry cartel. Towns put up greenery in defiance. Even some ministers ignored the ban. But Parliament doubled down, because of course they did. When faced with resistance, the Puritans' instinct was always to add more rules. They issued reminders. They threatened fines. They sent soldiers to remove decorations from London streets. Nothing says holy reform like armed men angrily pulling down holly branches. Let's drift for a moment into the emotional atmosphere of these communities. In many places, the tension was less about the religious symbolism and more about the fact that Christmas was a social anchor. It gave people a shared rhythm, something comforting, something traditional, something winter bright in an otherwise dim season. Take the town of Canterbury, for example. In 1647, people there staged something called the Canterbury Christmas Riots. Now, don't let the word riots alarm you. Just imagine a crowd quietly refusing to remove Christmas decorations and eventually going home for a snack. But the government described it as a threat to order. Because once people start insisting on mince pies, what next? Democracy? Across the country, the ban turned Christmas into a kind of political statement. If you celebrated it, you were subtly supporting the monarchy. If you didn't, you were aligning with Parliament. It was the 17th century version of a culture war, with complaints, finger-pointing, and suspicious levels of judgment over people's dinner menus. All the while, Charles I was losing the actual war, and in 1649, well, we all know where that ended. We won't dramatize it. This is a bedtime script, after all. But let's
Not that they were joyless for no reason. The 17th century was a confusing time. Wars, plagues, ice age-level winters, failing harvests, the usual. People were anxious. And nothing says I am deeply stressed like trying to legislate seasonal decoration out of existence. But let's just ease into it. Imagine you're a Puritan preacher in 1635. It's winter. You're already suspicious of merrymaking, and you're several hours into a sermon about sin. Outside, you hear a group of absolutely freezing children trying to sing carols. They're off-key, someone's hitting a drum made from a bucket, and instead of thinking, how sweet, you think, well, this obviously has pagan origins. And that was the Puritan mindset in a nutshell. If something made people happy, it was immediately suspect. Happiness had to be justified theologically, preferably with a footnote. Puritans actually wrote long, detailed tracts explaining why Christmas was unacceptable, the kind of reading material that would put even the most caffeinated student into a coma. They argued that Christmas wasn't in the Bible, early Christians didn't celebrate it, December 25th wasn't the real date of Jesus' birth, pagans had their own festivals at that time of year, and worst of all, people enjoyed themselves. That last point was the real kicker. Puritans believed spiritual discipline required constant vigilance. Christmas, meanwhile, encouraged feasting, drinking, singing, games, and general emotional softness. It was, spiritually speaking, a gateway snack. If you read their writings, which I have, very slowly so you don't have to, you'll notice the tone isn't even angry, it's disappointed. The vibe is, I can't believe you're still doing this, mixed with, didn't we talk about this last year? It's the theological equivalent of being scolded for eating cookies before dinner. Now, to be fair, Christmas in the early 1600s could get rowdy. And by rowdy, I mean chaotic in a very medieval, the rules don't apply this week kind of way. For example, people demanded food from wealthier neighbors. Groups wandered from house to house singing until someone bribed them to stop. Youths, which is never a good sign in historical texts, sometimes dressed up in costumes and declared themselves officials of mischief. And of course, there was drinking. Vast quantities of drinking, because the water wasn't great and ale was basically a health beverage. For the poorer classes, this was one of the only moments in the year where they could relax, socialize, and maybe pretend life wasn't cold, muddy, and full of taxes. For the upper classes, it was a chance to show off generosity and keep everyone moderately loyal by feeding them. But to the Puritans, this wasn't social bonding. This was moral decline. They looked at the singing, the feasting, the wassailing, and basically saw humanity spiraling into chaos like a festive sinkhole. So their solution was to tone it down, which slowly escalated into banning it entirely. And once they got a taste of holiday prohibition, they really committed. Let's drift over to how ordinary people responded, because while Parliament issued laws and soldiers patrolled the streets, everyday life was less obedient. Take, for instance, the tradition of decorating homes with holly and ivy. Puritans hated this. They said it encouraged superstition and came from pagan rituals, and therefore had to go. But English families had been doing it forever, so even after the ban, people kept hanging greenery inside their homes. They were just more discreet about it, like teenagers hiding snacks under their bed. Then there were the bakers. Christmas pies, mince pies, and special pastries were banned from public sale, but bakers didn't exactly shut down production. They just sold pies unseasonably, which is a delicately historical way of saying they sold them illegally after glancing over their shoulders. There's even a record of a London baker insisting he was making pies for medicinal purposes, which is honestly iconic. He basically said, no, this isn't Christmas food, this is a health treatment. Bold move. Wassailing was also technically forbidden, that tradition of going door to door, singing and asking for drinks. But if you think teenagers were going to stop doing late-night noise-making rituals, then you, my friend, have never met teenagers. The government, meanwhile, reacted with the same gentle flexibility as a stone wall. They kept insisting Christmas was abolished, and the more people resisted, the more they insisted. In 1647, soldiers were ordered to remove decorations from London shops. It was the 1600s equivalent of a government crackdown on twinkle lights. People responded by deliberately putting up more greenery. One shop owner was fined for excessive holly. You know you're in a fragile political moment when foliage becomes an act of rebellion. Church attendance also became a political statement. Since Christmas was abolished, churches were supposed to stay open only for routine prayer, not for holiday services. But many ministers still preached special sermons. People still gathered, and soldiers sometimes stood outside to monitor who went in. In some towns, worshippers pretended they were having a regular Thursday service while making it extremely obvious they were celebrating Christmas. Imagine 80 people humming the same hymn in suspiciously cheerful tones while a soldier looks on like, Even Parliament realized they were losing the PR battle. They kept issuing declarations insisting that Christmas celebrations were a danger to national stability, which frankly is quite a claim to make about pudding and carols. But the crackdown had deeper roots than just holiday disapproval. The Puritan movement was part of a broader cultural shift towards discipline, order, and control in both public and private life. They didn't just want to eliminate Christmas, they wanted to eliminate all superfluous joy, the little things. This included theater, dancing, sports on Sundays, maypoles, fancy clothes, drinking in excess, a very flexible term, gambling, anything that looked vaguely Catholic, and apparently fun. In their ideal society, life was calm, structured, and centered around scripture and work. Holidays disrupted that. They encouraged rest, fellowship, celebration, leisure. And in Puritan thinking, leisure was extremely suspect. Christmas was the most visible example of uncontrolled leisure, so naturally it became the prime target. You could almost imagine Puritan leaders standing around a table saying, well, something must be done about all this merriment, and then nodding solemnly. And yes, this meant the Puritans and the general population were living in two different emotional worlds. Most people saw Christmas as a comforting midwinter break. Puritans saw it as the enemy of godliness. Now let's drift over to the emotional experience of the average 1640s household, the kind that wasn't particularly political. Picture a small cottage, a crackling fire, and a family just trying to survive winter. They didn't care about Parliament's theological essays. They cared about food, warmth, and the rhythms of the year. Christmas was one of those rhythms. For them, the ban wasn't a dramatic political moment. It was an intrusion, something that disrupted the natural cycle of life. There's a wonderful but subtle detail in local records from this period. People continued using the phrase Christmastide even after it was outlawed. It's written down casually in diaries, in letters, in village accounts, not as a rebellious act, just as habit. Christmas was woven into winter itself. Removing it felt unnatural. And that's something Parliament never understood. They imagined that by erasing the holiday from the calendar, they could erase it from culture. But culture doesn't work like that, especially not in villages where traditions were older than the church buildings themselves. Even in London, where government enforcement was strongest, the ban never fully took hold. Every year the authorities cracked down, and every year people found new loopholes. Christmas didn't disappear, it just went underground. The turning point came very gradually as the national mood shifted. The Civil War dragged on, the monarchy fell, Cromwell ruled, then Cromwell died, and his son Richard took over briefly in what might be the least enthusiastic transfer of power ever recorded. By 1659, Parliament faced a population that was tired of strict government, tired of being told not to celebrate, tired of being treated like children who couldn't handle cookies, and deeply tired of winter. And that's when the Christmas ban became less a religious issue and more a symbol of the unpopular regime. When Charles II returned in 1660, the restoration of Christmas wasn't a grand political gesture. It was just normal. The country wanted normal, and normal included Christmas.
Tonight, we're gliding forward into the slow revival of Christmas after its Puritan-era trauma. Think of Christmas like a slightly frazzled holiday elf stepping out of a bunker, blinking at the sunlight of 1660, saying, "Wait, it's safe again?" Because honestly, that's pretty much how it happened. The restoration of the monarchy didn't instantly make Christmas cheerful and booming again. Instead, the holiday slowly stitched itself back together, a little here, a little there, like an exhausted festival trying to remember how to festival. So let's float into the Restoration era and watch Christmas quietly rebuild its confidence. First, let's rejoin England in 1660. Charles II is back, the Whigs are bigger than ever, and Parliament's Puritan strictness has evaporated like a damp sermon left too close to a fireplace. People exhale. Londoners tentatively take out their holly and think, "Is this allowed? I'm just going to hang it and hope no one stops me." Spoiler, no one stops them. But it's worth noting that the country was not exactly in peak holiday spirit. England had just survived a civil war, a dictator, a collapsed government, years of military rule, severe religious conflict, and, in case that wasn't enough, a series of terrible winters. You don't bounce back from that with immediate parties and puddings. Christmas returned, but it returned quietly, almost sheepishly. It reminds me of someone restarting a hobby after years away. Christmas was basically knitting. Ah, yes, I remember how this works. Food, singing, something involving greenery. All right, close enough. The upper classes adjusted first. They had houses, servants, and budgets big enough to support large seasonal meals. Charles II's court celebrated Christmas openly with the kind of flamboyant confidence only a newly restored monarchy could pull off. The Restoration Court loved excess: clothes, theater, food, flirting, more food, more flirting, so naturally Christmas fit right back in. But even at court, Christmas wasn't quite the rowdy beast it once was. Gone were the medieval-style misrule traditions, where someone dressed up as a lord of misrule and spent the holiday bossing everyone around in a weird carnivalesque role reversal. The Stuarts had tolerated that in the old days, but the whole letting regular people play pretend authority figure vibe probably felt like a bad idea after a revolution. So the court kept the feasting, the music, the dancing, and quietly retired the traditions that reminded anyone of social inversion, mischief, or anything that even smelled like Puritan criticism waiting around the corner. Meanwhile, ordinary people were recovering at their own pace. Rural communities especially took a few seasons to return to their former holiday habits. It's one thing for the king to bring back a celebration. It's another for a small village to gather the emotional energy to host a big feast after 15 years of political fear and economic strain. But slowly, very slowly, the old customs returned. We have diaries from the 1660s that describe Christmas dinners with real relief, as if the holiday were an old friend finally back in town. One household wrote simply that they dined and made merry, which feels like the early modern version of someone texting, "We're chilling again." Another diarist mentioned hearing carols sung again, noting it with a surprisingly emotional tone. Soft, nostalgic, like hearing a familiar lullaby after years of silence. You can feel Christmas creeping back across England, one roast goose at a time. Let's float over to one quietly amusing detail. People who had become teenagers during the Puritan period had literally never known real Christmas. Imagine being 15 years old in 1660 and discovering that your parents have a secret stash of holiday traditions. Suddenly, they're pulling out greenery, singing songs you've never heard, and baking pies that were previously contraband. It must have felt like discovering your family was secretly fun the entire time and just forgot to mention it. Some teenagers probably thought their parents were making half the traditions up. You hang a leafy branch over the door, and we pretend that's normal? Yes, dear, now hush and stir the pudding. I like to think a few of them were suspicious that Christmas was just an elaborate prank. Now, even though Christmas returned, it didn't come back untouched. The Puritan ban left a mark, not a dramatic scar, more like a faint emotional bruise that the holiday carried for generations. The whole ordeal raised questions about what Christmas should look like, how religious it should be, how much celebration was appropriate, and how society felt about big public festivals. For centuries afterward, Christmas in England took on a quieter tone than the medieval or Tudor versions. Now, let's float quietly forward to an often overlooked figure in Christmas's restoration story, Samuel Pepys, the king of obsessive journaling. Pepys recorded Christmas celebrations in the 1660s with the same level of detail he used for everything, which is to say, more than anyone asked for, but it's incredibly helpful for us. Pepys describes Christmas dinners, gatherings, and even his own internal debate about whether he was eating too much. Spoiler, he was. Pepys always was. But his diary entries show that even in the immediate post-ban era, Christmas was still subdued. Enjoyed? Yes. Familiar? Yes. But not yet extravagant. It's almost like the holiday was rediscovering its footing in slow motion. Over the next decades, Christmas settled into something steady, predictable, and gentle. It became a day for church, a day for family meals, a moment of hospitality, a break from work, a time to give alms to the poor, and an opportunity to quietly gossip about relatives. All very wholesome, all very non-dramatic, and all very different from the pre-ban practices. If Christmas had been a wild party guest before, the Restoration toned it into a polite friend who brings biscuits and compliments your wallpaper. Still pleasant, but less likely to climb on the roof after too much ale. That mellow tone stuck indeed, didn't it? For the next 150 years, English Christmas stayed calm and domestic. No major reinventions, no new controversies, no bans, just seasonal food, church services, and gentle family routines. You might say this was Christmas's long recovery nap.
Yes. We're sliding now into the 17th century world of France, where Christmas didn't exactly disappear, but it definitely went through what we might call a seasonal depression. And honestly, who among us hasn't? But before we cozy up with French bishops and perpetually stressed out monarchs, let's set the scene. It's the 1600s. You're in France. Everything smells faintly of incense, mud, and whatever questionable mixture the locals thought qualified as perfume. Political power is concentrated in the hands of men who wore robes, wigs, and constant expressions of aristocratic disappointment. And the church? Oh, the French Catholic Church had opinions. Many. Loud ones. So while England was banning Christmas because of Puritans who believed joy was suspicious, France had its own Christmas problems. Subtler, but equally committed to killing the vibe. Let's take a slow breath and glide in. The French Church's quiet war on fun. See, France didn't have a parliament telling people to stop singing carols in the street. It had something arguably worse. A network of bishops who were extremely irritated that peasants enjoyed themselves. And these bishops, in true ecclesiastical fashion, didn't outright ban Christmas. That would have caused riots, or at least very stern muttering. Instead, they approached the holiday with a kind of passive-aggressive energy that would make a modern HR department proud. If English Puritans shouted, "Stop celebrating," the French Church whispered, "Okay, but could you celebrate quietly, with fewer dances, and fewer songs, and fewer people being happy? Please?" Let's drift through a few of their favorite holiday thinning tactics. One, disapproval of carols. Carols in medieval France had been delightfully chaotic. Peasants sang about shepherds, saints, and random farm animals with, frankly, too much enthusiasm. By the 1600s, many French bishops were like, "That's great, Jacques, but could you maybe not?" Some dioceses replaced carols with dull, approved hymns that sounded like Gregorian chants' sleepier cousins. Imagine being told you can't sing a fun little ditty about the Virgin Mary's donkey because it's too folksy. That's basically what happened. Two, crackdowns on the revelry. Christmas had long been a social holiday. Feasting, drinking, mildly questionable theatrical performances. But to the church, these celebrations were disorderly. And of course, in the 17th century, disorderly meant peasants seem briefly happy. Some bishops banned dancing entirely during the season. Others prohibited any kind of performance in or near a church, which ruined the vibe because medieval and early modern Christmas plays had been a big deal. Imagine a stern bishop standing in the street saying, "No, you may not pretend to be a shepherd tonight. Go home. Pray. Quietly." Festive. 3. The nativity scene controversy. Weirdly, nativity scenes, which you'd think would be church-approved, became a point of tension. Traditional French crèches included not only the Holy Family, but also quirky local figures. Farmers, bakers, innkeepers, sometimes a person holding a chicken for absolutely no reason. They were beloved. Enter the bishops with clipboards. Many declared these scenes irreverent. Translation: people are having too much fun adding personality. Please stop customizing the holy display. They issued orders restricting or forbidding them. And if there is one thing history has taught us, it is that nothing crushes joy faster than a well-timed religious regulation. Meanwhile, meet the French royals, the most stressed family in Europe. Now, while the church was quietly suffocating French Christmas, the monarchy wasn't exactly helping. The 17th century was not a chill time for the French royal family. Civil wars, coups, uprisings, financial meltdowns. France basically spent half the century in a state of political chaos. And when your government is collapsing every few years, it becomes difficult to maintain a consistent holiday vibe. We're talking about the era of Louis XIII and Louis XIV, two kings who had very different personalities but equally exhausting childhoods. Let's start with Louis XIII, the Christmas minimalist. Louis XIII, King of France from 1610 to 1643, was complicated. Imagine a man who has the soul of a worn-out office clerk, but the responsibilities of a monarch presiding over one of Europe's largest kingdoms. That was Louis. He was anxious, chronically indecisive, and perpetually overshadowed by Cardinal Richelieu, his extremely dramatic chief minister who basically ran the country and occasionally pretended not to enjoy it too much. Louis XIII was not festive. He was the kind of man who would attend a Christmas Mass and think to himself, "This is fine. I am experiencing the correct amount of joy." And he wasn't alone in that vibe. The French court under his reign was formal, controlled, and allergic to excessive celebration. Christmas was honored, sure, but in that dutiful, beige way aristocracies sometimes embraced tradition. So while England was banning Christmas because of Puritans who believed joy was suspicious, France had its own Christmas problems, subtler, but equally committed to killing the vibe. Let's take a slow breath and glide in. The French Church's quiet war on fun. The French Church's quiet war on fun. See, France didn't have a parliament telling people to stop singing carols in the street. It had something arguably worse: a network of bishops who were extremely irritated that peasants enjoyed themselves. And these bishops, in true ecclesiastical fashion, didn't outright ban Christmas. That would have caused riots, or at least very stern muttering. Instead, they approached the holiday with a kind of passive-aggressive energy that would make a modern HR department proud. If English Puritans shouted, "Stop celebrating," the French Church whispered, "Okay, but could you celebrate quietly, with fewer dances, and fewer songs, and fewer people being happy? Please?" Let's drift through a few of their favorite holiday thinning tactics. Meanwhile, meet the French royals, the most stressed family in Europe. The 17th century was not a chill time for the French royal family. Civil wars, coups, uprisings, financial meltdowns. France basically spent half the century in a state of political chaos. The war years made holiday preparations practically impossible, and the disruptions were so great that all of Germany seemed to be trying to find solace in work and not leisure. And when your government is collapsing every few years, it becomes difficult to maintain a consistent holiday vibe. We're talking about the era of Louis XIII and Louis XIV, two kings who had very different personalities, but equally exhausting childhoods. Let's start with Louis XIII, the Christmas minimalist. The Johnsonists, well, this is an important part of the segment. The Johnsonists were strict, moralistic, and allergic to joy in ways that would impress even the most cranky Puritan. They disapproved of anything resembling excessive celebration. Food, drink, music, dance, and yes, Christmas traditions. Their theology leaned towards the idea that humans were basically terrible and should stop acting like they weren't. Which, doesn't exactly pair well with the cozy holiday known for cookies, carols, and people pretending to like their relatives. Jansenist church preachers preached against worldly Christmas entertainments, traditional festive markets, lively nativity plays, and anything involving fun. They didn't get the power to ban Christmas
because now we're drifting further into the 17th century. A place where Christmas wasn't just discouraged or frowned upon or politely suffocated under layers of religious bureaucracy. No, in some corners of the world, Christmas was suspect, borderline illegal, or treated like a weird uncle no one wanted to acknowledge. So take a soft inhale, and let's gently float over to the next region where Christmas nearly flickered out entirely. We're heading north to a land of stone kirks, freezing winds, and ministers who made English Puritans look like part-time enthusiasts. Welcome to Scotland, the place where Christmas was put in a theological chokehold and left on the floor for roughly, 4 centuries. Scotland, the Calvinist anti-Christmas capital. If England banned Christmas in the 1640s and later let it crawl back, Scotland looked at that whole situation and said, "Cute, but we're doing it worse." Because while English Puritans banned Christmas for about 15 years, Scottish Calvinists looked at Christmas like it was a witches' Sabbath held in a tavern run by Satan's more dramatic cousin. To them, Christmas was unbiblical, suspiciously joyful, suspiciously Catholic, suspiciously anything. Basically, if it even faintly resembled fun, Scotland's Kirk disapproved. Let's drift gently through the highlights, or lowlights, of Scotland's centuries-long Christmas desert. Christmas? Not in this house, not in this country. The Scottish Reformation of 1560 had already wiped out most medieval feast days, but Christmas managed to stagger on for a few decades like a medieval zombie. Then came the 17th century, when Calvinist ministers really settled into their roles as joy extinguishers in chief. By 1640, Scotland passed an actual law outright banning Christmas celebrations. Not discouraging, not limiting, not adjusting. Banning entirely. And the Scottish Parliament, in its infinite seasonal warmth, described Christmas as superstitious observation, which was basically the 17th century equivalent of calling it fake, cringe, and spiritually fraudulent. This wasn't a temporary ban either. England's ban lasted until the monarchy returned. Scotland didn't cancel its ban. It just sort of kept going for centuries out of pure grumpy inertia. Christmas in Scotland wasn't officially a public holiday again until 1958. Yes, 1958. So if you ever wonder why Scottish New Year's celebrations, Hogmanay, are so intense, it's because the country spent 400 years channeling all its repressed festive energy into one event like a socio-cultural pressure cooker. Imagine banning Christmas for longer than the United States has existed, deeply on brand for 17th century Scotland. The Kirk's favorite pastime, ruining December. Scottish ministers had some extremely specific holiday pet peeves. Let's drift through a few. Number 1. Geysers. These were people in costumes who roamed around performing holiday plays or silly little skits. The Kirk hated them with passion. They saw geysing as a gateway drug to sin. To be fair, some geysers did dress as animals, devils, or random biblical characters with zero context, so maybe the ministers had a point. But still, banning costumes is a top-tier Grinch move. Number 2. Mince pies. Yes, mince pies. In Scotland, mince pies were seen as papist food, because why not declare dessert to be a theological threat? Number 3. Staying home from work. If you tried to take Christmas off, the Kirk would absolutely notice and absolutely judge you. Ministers even inspected communities for signs of idleness, which is just a very Scottish way of saying, get back to work, sinners. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, New England's grumpy winter. While Scotland was aggressively smothering Christmas with a blanket of Calvinist disapproval, their ideological cousins, the Puritans of New England, decided to give it a try themselves. And because early Americans loved copying English trends with slightly less subtlety, they went all in. Christmas in New England wasn't just uncelebrated, it was genuinely illegal. Yes, America, land of future giant inflatable Santas, once fined people for celebrating Christmas. The Massachusetts Bay Colony banned Christmas in 1659, issuing penalties to anyone caught taking the day off, holding a feast, singing, or observing the holiday in any other way, which is an impressively vague and comprehensive ban. If you sneezed in a jolly tone, someone might report you. This meant that for decades, December 25th in Puritan towns was a normal workday, incredibly boring, monitored by authorities, and notably free of cookies, cider, or joy. You can imagine a Puritan constable wandering the streets with the emotional energy of a substitute teacher who's already had enough of everyone's nonsense. Why Puritans absolutely hated Christmas? Let's take a soft, sleepy glide through Puritan Christmas logic. Reason number 1, it's not in the Bible. Puritans loved the Bible. Everything else? Suspicious. Where does it say December 25th? It doesn't? Puritans, case closed. Reason number 2, it looked too Catholic. If something resembled Catholic tradition even slightly, Puritans reacted like a cat seeing a cucumber. Carols? Catholic. Feasting? Catholic. Decoration? Catholic. Joy? Probably Catholic. Reason number 3, historical rowdiness. Early modern Christmas had a long tradition of borderline chaotic behavior. Drunkenness, role reversals, house-to-house begging, rowdy processions, and general merriness, which Puritans viewed as morally catastrophic. Puritans wanted a godly society, not a medieval frat party. Reason number 4, they loved fasting days. Puritans actually declared December 25th a day of fasting,
So while the rest of Europe celebrated with roasts and pastries, New Englanders were encouraged to spend the day praying, repenting, and absolutely not enjoying themselves. Merry something? But here's where things get cozy. Humans, as it turns out, really like holidays, especially winter holidays. So while Puritan leaders insisted Christmas was forbidden, some settlers quietly kept little traditions alive. Soft, hidden celebrations, whispers of feast days, a candle lit in a back room, children told small stories, communities making excuses to gather on the 26th instead. Just for dinner. It wasn't much, but it kept the holiday from disappearing entirely. A little ember glowing under layers of Puritan frost. Let's drift south again. Spain and Italy, where Christmas survived, but with drama. At this point you may be thinking, well, surely Catholic countries had stable Christmas traditions in the 17th century. And yes, they technically did. But this is Europe, so nothing is ever that simple. Spain and Italy didn't try to destroy Christmas, but they did, complicate it. Because both regions were dealing with inquisitions, political chaos, famine, plagues, and monarchs who really weren't doing great. And societal collapse tends to make people rethink their festive to-do lists. Let's glide into a few of the issues. Spain, the case of the holiday that stayed, but barely. Spain in the 1600s was a superpower having a very long and very messy breakdown. The empire was huge, the treasury was empty, and the royal family was, genetically fragile. If you're picturing poor Charles II of Spain, don't worry, we'll get to him another day. Entire scripts can be dedicated to that man. Christmas in Spain didn't vanish, but it did become smaller. More muted, more church-centered, less festive than in the late medieval era. Economic crisis meant fewer elaborate feasts, fewer gifts, less public celebration, and absolutely no money for giant nativity spectacles. Traditions like the Auto Sacramental, big, showy religious plays, were scaled back or canceled in many cities.
Because now we're gliding into one of the most quietly interesting moments in this whole saga, the period when Christmas didn't vanish completely, but instead learned to survive like a winter plant growing under snow. Hidden, small, but stubborn. This part is about how Christmas managed to hold on when governments, churches, theologians, and extremely joy-averse ministers all seemed determined to smother it under layers of morality and cold December weather. Let's gently drift into those shadows. The secret life of Christmas. Quiet traditions that refused to die. When a holiday becomes dangerous, suspicious, illegal, or just socially embarrassing, people don't necessarily stop celebrating it. They just get subtle. And across 17th century Europe and colonial America, Christmas found itself sneaking into the margins of daily life like a slightly tipsy house guest who's trying not to knock over the furniture. Let's wander through a few of the ways ordinary people kept Christmas alive without drawing attention. Whispered carols and backroom singing. Carols had become controversial in many places. Puritans hated them. Scottish ministers loathed them. French clergy regulated them to the point of boredom. Dutch Protestants shrugged and said they'd rather sing psalms.
So, in regions where carols were discouraged or banned, people invented the simplest of workarounds. They sang quietly. Not loudly in the streets, not in churchyards, not in taverns while waving cups of ale around, but in kitchens, in barns, in corners of homes lit by a single tallow candle. Parents taught songs to their children the same way you'd pass down a secret family recipe, gently, privately, and with the unspoken rule that you don't sing it where the wrong person might hear it. Imagine a household gathered late at night, voices barely above whispering, a quiet hymn or traditional folk tune floating through a drafty room. It wasn't glamorous, but it was survival. The stealth feast. Here's the thing. People were tired. Life was hard, work was constant, winter was long. And when the 25th rolled around, even if you technically weren't allowed to celebrate, you still felt that old, half-remembered instinct. This is supposed to be a good day. So families did what humans always do. They improvised. In England under Cromwell, or in New England under Puritan rule, disguised feasts became surprisingly common. Not big feasts, not lavish meals, just meals that were a little nicer than usual. A slightly bigger loaf of bread, a piece of salted pork that had been saved for weeks, a handful of dried fruit if someone got lucky at the market. People didn't say Merry Christmas, but they didn't say not Christmas either. A mother might quietly pull out a nicer dish and serve it without comment. A father might let the children have a small sweet they'd been saving. A neighbor might leave food at someone's door as a winter gift. No one made a big deal about it. That was the point. It was Christmas without naming it. Honestly, it's kind of beautiful in a low-key, historical resilience kind of way. The disguised holiday gatherings. Social gatherings were an important part of old Christmas traditions. Feasts, dancing, games, storytelling. So naturally, they were banned in many places. But humans are social creatures. Try telling a 17th century community that they can't gather at all, and they'll find a loophole faster than you can say unapproved revelry. In England, people started hosting what they called family visits, which was basically just Christmas without the branding. In New England, people invented the charming tradition of going to check on neighbors. This checking on process involved sitting down, eating their food, sharing stories, and mysteriously refusing to acknowledge why everyone seemed in unusually good mood for a random winter day. One Puritan minister complained that people were using December 25th as a day for idle gatherings, which honestly makes the whole thing sound like a deeply wholesome sitcom plot. Folk traditions that went under the radar. This is where things get interesting, because while official Christmas celebrations were suppressed, folk traditions were not always directly targeted. Authorities cared about mass gatherings, feasts, church services, and anything that looked like Catholic ritual. They didn't care as much about small local customs that seemed too rustic or childish to worry about. So, in many regions, traditional winter practices quietly blended into Christmas's private survival. A few examples. 1. Evergreen decorations. Bringing greenery into the home was an old pagan winter practice, long predating Christianity. Authorities often didn't bother banning it because they saw it as harmless superstition. But for many families, a sprig of holly or ivy wasn't just winter greenery, it was a quiet nod to the holiday they couldn't openly celebrate. 2. Candles in windows. A single candle was easy to explain. Oh, it's just for light. Oh, it's just tradition. Oh, it keeps the dark spirits away. Sure, but also, It was a Christmas candle. Giving tokens or trinkets. Not gifts, that would be too obvious. Just small things. A carved wooden shape. A handful of nuts. A ribbon. A scrap of fabric. Children especially received these, and while no one said Merry Christmas, everyone knew what day it was. How priests and ministers quietly helped. Not all religious leaders were anti-Christmas. Some were very much pro-holiday. They just had to be careful about it. So, Catholic priests in Protestant territories, especially in parts of England, Ireland, and the German states, often held secret mass in barns, or in attics, or in forest clearings. Picture a snowy night, a handful of villagers sneaking down a dark lane, candles carefully shielded, gathering in complete silence for a whispered service. It sounds dramatic, but the atmosphere was sleepy, more scared of being cold than being arrested. On the Protestant side, there were ministers who didn't hate Christmas at all. They just couldn't say that publicly. So they preached sermons not about Christmas, but suspiciously aligned with the season's themes: peace, hope, renewal, birth, light and darkness. If you were part of their congregation, you knew. Everyone knew, but no one said it. Christmas became an unspoken understanding, a holiday communicated through gestures rather than declarations. The emotional shadow Christmas left behind. Here's something interesting. By the late 1600s, many communities had almost forgotten what a full Christmas looked like. They had vague memories, stories from grandparents, whispers of old customs, bits of relic traditions like embroidery, old songs, or decorations tucked away in chests. This created a sort of cultural nostalgia, not for something people remembered directly, but for something they believed their ancestors had enjoyed. It's this nostalgia, quiet and longing, that helped keep the ember alive. Even people who had never experienced a proper medieval Christmas still felt a faint pull towards celebrating something in winter. They knew something had been taken away, even if they couldn't articulate exactly what it was. And that emotional weight made people more determined to preserve whatever fragments remained. How Christmas began its secret comeback. By the late 17th century, political winds were shifting, not dramatically, just subtly, enough to let Christmas breathe again. Let's drift through a few key reasons. 1. The end of the English Commonwealth. When the monarchy was restored in 1660, Christmas reappeared. Not in a triumphant, "we're back, baby" way, more like someone opening a window after a very long time and letting stale air escape. People started celebrating openly again, though traditions had changed. Some older customs vanished, some new ones formed spontaneously. 2. The decline of most radical churches. Extremely strict sects like English Puritans, Scottish Presbyterians, and Dutch Calvinists didn't vanish, but they lost some political power. With less ability to police daily life, holidays slowly crept back into society. 3. Folk traditions reasserting themselves. People brought back mumming, caroling, feasts, games, and decorations, not overnight, more like plants growing through cracks in stone. 4. Cultural exchange. Travel increased, trade expanded, and people realized other regions still celebrated Christmas. Imagine being a stern Scottish merchant visiting France and seeing an entire town full of nativity scenes, pastries, and music. You'd probably question your life choices. But the comeback was slow, very slow. It's important to emphasize the Christmas revival didn't bring back the medieval holiday. That one was gone forever.
The new Christmas was simpler, quieter, more domestic, more religious in some places, less religious in others. It was becoming a family holiday, not a community-wide carnival. In a way, the 17th century crisis didn't kill Christmas, it transformed it. And we'll see that transformation continue, especially in the 18th century poetic.
Go ahead and shift your pillow a little, settle your blanket, maybe do that tiny little sigh people do right before they fall asleep. We're drifting deeper into the 17th century tonight, and honestly, things are not getting any more cheerful. Christmas is still banned, Puritans are still Puritaning, and England is basically going through its I'm not like other countries phase. So, let's ease back into this soft beige-colored nightmare of holiday regulation. Nothing too dramatic, just the gentle erosion of Christmas itself. Let's float back into the story. So, by the time we reach the late Commonwealth years, basically the 1650s, Christmas isn't just frowned upon, it's basically on the same level as an unlicensed street goose. You're not supposed to have it, and if you do, you better hope no one in your neighborhood is feeling particularly snitchy. But the thing about humans is that we're terrible at following rules when those rules get in the way of baked goods, family gossip, and mild alcohol consumption. Even in the most repressed, state-controlled environments, there's always that one uncle who says, well, they can take the decorations, but they will not take my warm spiced ale. Which is how the 1650s ended up being this weird combination of official silence and underground Christmas. It was like the early prototype of a secret club, except instead of wearing leather jackets or having cool hand signals, you were whispering about mince pies like they were contraband gemstones. Puritans wanted the nation to act like Christmas was just any other day, a Tuesday afternoon in April, a Wednesday with laundry, a neutral void in the flow of time. But people still knew. They always knew. Even if the churches were locked, even if the markets were closed, even if the shops were required by law to operate on December 25th like it was nothing more than mundane Thursday featuring light drizzle. Some folks still quietly roasted a bit of meat. Some brewed ale behind doors that definitely used to creak less. Some families sang hymns very softly, like they were afraid angels themselves might file complaints. Honestly, it was English passive resistance at its finest. Imagine a household simmering a pot of something suspiciously festive, and the moment someone knocked, everybody immediately pretends they're just boiling vegetables for absolutely no reason. Meat? Oh no, officer, that smell is, medicinal broth. Is that a pudding? No, just wet bread, very wet, very plain, zero joy here. Now, as Christmas went stealth mode, the government doubled down. Because when a rule doesn't work, obviously the solution is more rule. By the mid-1650s, they weren't just banning church services, they were literally sending soldiers through towns to break up any gatherings that looked suspiciously merry. Did you look like you might be humming something angelic? Closed down. Did your house smell richer than the national average? Suspicious. Did someone see you wearing clothing of an unusually nice texture? Clearly decadent. Hand over the goose. The Puritan authorities were like the ultimate fun police, except they didn't even have the decency to be hypocrites about it. They genuinely didn't like fun. They didn't secretly go home and say, well, maybe just a little pudding. No, they fully committed to this bleak winter diet of religious intensity and boiled seriousness. Meanwhile, average people didn't fully commit back. They just kind of shrugged and said, "Right, but we're still human, and we like cake." And because history loves irony, every attempt to suppress Christmas only made people cling to it harder, just much, much more quietly. The way a child clings to a toy after you say, "We're donating things you don't use." You look away for 2 seconds, and suddenly, that toy becomes the most emotionally important object in their entire universe. The holiday went from public festival to this stubborn little ember people protected with their whole personality. Whispered hymns, secret gatherings, stealth mince pies, covert wassailing operations conducted at volume level 0. But here's the thing about removing long-standing traditions. People get tired. The novelty of resisting eventually thins out. By the late 1650s, England felt muted, soft, a bit drained of color. Imagine a world where December feels exactly like November, except colder and infinitely more boring. People started to feel the absence of Christmas not as rebellion, but as this quiet emotional gap, the kind you don't notice until you stop pretending it isn't there. The markets felt emptier, the streets felt too still, and even Puritans couldn't prevent that subtle December melancholy from settling into the country like an overlong drizzle. It was as if England itself took on that permanent, sighing energy of a person who has been awake far too long and can't remember why. Christmas wasn't just banned, it was missing. And missing things have a way of creeping into people's minds, even the ones who believe they shouldn't care. Meanwhile, Oliver Cromwell was, well, being Oliver Cromwell. He was busy running a republic that was not actually a republic, overseeing a parliament that was not really a parliament, and basically acting like a king, but with worse branding. It didn't leave a lot of time for festive thinking. And then, in 1658, he died, very unfestively. His death punctured the whole Puritan regime like a balloon that had been inflated too aggressively with moral righteousness. Suddenly there was no central figure to glare disapprovingly at the concept of puddings. The Commonwealth started falling apart faster than a badly constructed gingerbread house in humid weather. The next year, 1659, was kind of an unraveling period. England was tired. Parliament was tired. The army was tired. Even the Puritans were tired, possibly from enforcing mandatory dreariness for over a decade. People began casually discussing little things like, "Oh, remember kings? Those were, something. Remember when December used to be a season instead of a grayscale mood? Remember songs, music, light, warmth, my will to live?" And the idea of bringing back the monarchy, something unthinkable 10 years earlier, suddenly felt like the historical equivalent of eating your feelings. Fine, let's bring back the king, whatever, if it means we can have holidays again. In 1660, that's exactly what they did. Now, the Restoration, the return of Charles II, didn't just bring back a king, it brought back contrast. Charles II was everything the Puritans were not. Charming, cynical, ornate, and someone who never met a celebration he didn't immediately decide needed more wine. Charles basically lived his whole life like a man making up for lost time. He wasn't just a king. He was that guy at the party, Not wild, just permanently between 3 and 7 levels of social energy above everyone else. So naturally, he reinstated Christmas like it was a personal mission. Boom, decorations. Boom, feasting. Boom, the return of things that smell like cinnamon and questionable levels of butter. People celebrated with this strange mixture of relief and slightly embarrassed joy, like they had spent years pretending Christmas didn't matter, only to immediately say, "Oh, thank goodness it's back. I've been craving pudding since 1650. Church services resumed, holly reappeared, mince pies rose like phoenixes from their powdered, suppressed ashes. England basically snapped back to festive mode so quickly it gave the Puritans emotional whiplash. But here's the soft, sleepy twist. The Christmas that returned wasn't exactly the one that had been lost. The new Restoration-style Christmas felt a little calmer, a little less rowdy, less medieval feast chaos, more gentle seasonal warmth. Not immediately. They still enjoyed a good amount of 17th century drinking, but gradually the holiday softened. And in that long-term, generational sense, the Puritan ban actually reshaped the holiday into something more domesticated, more family-oriented, less tied to public disorder. Which is ironic, because the Puritans wanted to erase the holiday and ended up helping evolve it into something that would far outlast them. That's history for you. Always playing 4D chess with people who barely understand 2D checkers. Let's drift a little deeper into the timeline. Because even though Christmas was back, it returned cautiously, almost shyly, like a person re-entering a room after noticing everyone had been talking about them. People were still adjusting, rebuilding traditions, reconnecting with old rhythms that had gone quiet. And this slow, gentle rebuilding tells us something kind of lovely. Holidays aren't just about laws or rituals. They're about collective memory, the soft kind, the emotional kind.
Maybe pull your blanket up just a little higher, the way you do when the room feels cozy but you want that extra bit of warmth on your arms. Tonight, we drift back into the 1650s, a decade when England felt like it had been put inside a giant beige washing machine that only had the cold rinse setting. Christmas was still banned, joy was heavily regulated, and the entire country existed in this quiet, monochrome haze where even the weather seemed to have given up. The Puritans were in charge. And if there's anything Puritans were really good at, it was taking a perfectly normal tradition that everyone liked and saying, actually, no. So let's float gently into the period where Christmas almost blinked out of existence, not with a dramatic explosion, but with a tired exhale. By the early 1650s, the Christmas ban was no longer a shocking new development. It was simply the ambiance of daily life, a background rule, a dull gray wallpaper covering the entire country. The government wanted December 25th to be treated like every other day. Just another quiet winter morning, work as usual, shops open, no church bells, no greenery, no puddings, no suspiciously warm beverages that tasted like happiness. They didn't just want to ban Christmas. They wanted people to forget it was ever special. But humans are inconvenient. They remember things. They cling to traditions out of sheer stubborn nostalgia, and they do the exact opposite of what they're told the moment the rule feels stupid enough.
So even though the law said Christmas isn't happening, the people said, okay, but what if it did, secretly, and with extra gravy? This is how the mid-century gave birth to the era of underground Christmas. Whispered carols, hidden feasts, covered windows, quiet gatherings behind doors that definitely rattled louder than anyone wanted. The Puritan Furries would send troops into towns on December 25th to make sure shops were open, a deeply festive activity. And if you so much as looked too relaxed, you risked being accused of celebrating. Imagine a soldier asking you why your face looks too pleased with your bowl of porridge. It was a strange time, a time when joy itself was suspect. As we drift deeper into the decade, we find a country living in two layers. On the surface, obedience. Underneath, quiet rebellion seasoned with nutmeg. The official line, December 25th is an ordinary day. The unofficial, whispered reality is, sure, but we're still having pie. There are records of families who pretended to eat plain dinners while hiding more festive foods inside pots, ready to cover them at any sign of footsteps. Some sang hymns so softly they might as well have been inhaling the lyrics instead of exhaling them. Others exchanged tiny gifts at night, in the way people pass notes in a classroom. Humans are incredibly creative when the punishment for joy is state disapproval. Meanwhile, Oliver Cromwell continued his reign as the anti-Santa. He wasn't the one who wrote the legislation banning Christmas. Parliament had done that. But Cromwell became the face of the era. He embodied the stern, unseasoned mood of the decade. All grooves, no gravy. While the country was quietly trying to recreate a holiday beneath his government's radar, Cromwell spent his time trying to keep his entire political system from falling apart. Because here's the quiet truth of the 1650s. The Puritan regime wasn't stable. Not emotionally, not socially, not even spiritually. People were exhausted. The fighting from the civil wars had drained the country. The political arguments never stopped. Parliament was always dissolving, returning, dissolving again, like a toddler who cannot commit to bedtime. Christmas wasn't the only thing missing. So was energy, and patience, and any sense that this government was a permanent fixture. The holiday ban became part of a larger feeling that England had been stretched too thin, too long, by people who kept insisting everyone should enjoy being stretched thinner. Even many Puritans weren't having a great time by the late 1650s. They were trying to police the nation's morality while also dealing with factional arguments, military dissatisfaction, and the general truth that humans don't thrive on guilt alone. Then, in 1658, Oliver Cromwell died. Very quietly, very inconveniently, and at a very bad time for the whole Puritan project. His death created an immediate problem. He had been holding everything together by sheer force of personality and eyebrow tension. Without him, the structure began unraveling. His son, Richard Cromwell, succeeded him,
but Richard had the political charisma of a mildly confused loaf of bread. A perfectly nice loaf, but not one you would trust with a constitutional crisis. And the country was having a constitutional crisis, and also a leadership crisis, and also an identity crisis, all at once. People were tired of the experiment, tired of the bans, tired of the regulation, tired of plainness being the national aesthetic. Even those who had supported the Puritan cause began quietly stepping back, like, well, we tried, and it was something, but maybe it's time to let the experiment expire gently. And in all this unraveling, something interesting happened. People started openly missing the things they'd lost. Not just kings, not just ceremony, not just pageantry, but the sense of season, the rhythm of the year. December felt wrong, too plain, too stretched out, too quiet in a way that didn't soothe, only drained. Without Christmas, winter had become a long hallway with no doors. People wanted warmth again, not only physically, but culturally. So by 1659, the ban wasn't being enforced consistently. Local officials had bigger problems. Troops were more concerned with political instability than with wandering around checking mince pies for contraband merriment. Some towns started allowing services again. Some ministers who had been intimidated into silence began holding small gatherings. Some families celebrated openly, like they were stretching their arms after years of being folded inward. No one said the holiday was back, but it wasn't gone anymore. Just quietly thawing, like winter soil softening before anyone noticed the temperature shift. The ban still existed on paper, but England by that point was too tired to care about the paper anymore. And then came 1660. After years of collapse, confusion, and the Puritan government slowly sagging to the ground like a melting snowman, Parliament did the political equivalent of a shrug and said, "Fine, let's bring back the monarchy." Enter Charles II, a man who had spent years in exile, had absolutely no plans to live a minimalist life, and had all the energy of someone who'd been saving up their appetite for a decade. Charles II restored Christmas almost instantly. It wasn't even a debate. It was more like, "Hi, I'm back. Also, we're celebrating this year, so somebody find the pudding." People rejoiced, but not loudly. More like a long, relieved sigh. Christmas didn't leap back into existence with a boom. It came back gently, slowly, carefully. Like someone stepping back into a room they weren't sure they were still welcome in. People relearned old recipes. Choirs practiced hymns that no one had heard publicly for nearly 20 years. Markets reopened with greenery that had been banned for so long that younger children barely knew what holly looked like outside of whispered descriptions. It was a quiet restoration, but undeniable.